Welcome to the Officio Spotlight podcast. My name is Simon Lipscomb and thank you very much for listening. Today I'm delighted to say I'm joined by a senior procurement practitioner. In the UK we would call local government, but I think in other parts of the world would probably be called regional government or even state government in the US. And my guest is Darren Knowd. So Darren is the head of procurement, sales and business services at Durham County Council, where he's worked for the last 15 years. And prior to that, he was a purchasing manager at the car maker Nissan. Darren, thanks so much for joining us today. There are lots of areas I'm really interested and keen to kind of discuss with you. But perhaps as a starting point, even as I was just saying that, your job title, particularly in a local government context, is really interesting. It's not actually one I've ever seen before. I mean, maybe we could start by just understanding what your role is.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. I've listened to several of the previous podcasts, always found them interesting. So it's great to be able to contribute and share some thoughts. Yeah, I think the job title, I think the chief executive made it up, to be honest with you. So I'm a procurement person of origin, as will evolve during the discussion, but I was asked to also head up our commercial sales area. So as well as spending £700 million on goods, work, services and things, the council also sells services to schools, academies, colleges, police, fire. That very much was done individually, service by service, and it wasn't really coordinated across the council. So they asked me, would I be prepared to lead the commercial strategy for the organisation to standardise the approach from a service offer point of view, from a relationship management point of view, which I agreed to do. And then on top of that, the council decided to centralise, not physically, but organisationally, all of its administration resources. So anybody who wasn't a technical professional, like a lawyer or a procurement officer or a project manager or an accountant and social work and so on. So anybody who kind of did like project administration work, we wanted to centralise all of that, standardise it, optimise it, etc. And I think I made a mistake in, as I alluded to, I spent a little bit of time at Nissan running the supply development team, which was all about what was these days called Six Sigma lean techniques and the like. So I made the mistake in telling somebody I'd done it, and they said, well, will you also head this up? So I'm now head of procurement, sales and business services, and I've inherited 600 admin people across the business trying to make efficiencies out of that, which has worked really well. But it's really varied. To be honest, it's actually given me a much better understanding of the wider business. I mean, I know a lot because of the corporate role in procurement, but I've got admin people in every service. So that's given me a lot more insight, connections, relationships that maybe hitherto I didn't have. So probably a bit of a method in the madness, but it works and it's fun.
And I imagine also that kind of to have on the one hand the procurement responsibility, but then also have that commercial sales perspective. That's fascinating, actually. I've never actually seen that in a single role before. Yeah,
and I think you'll find, particularly in local government, with government cuts being as they have been, councils have had to become more commercial. And if we have spare capacity, capability, or maybe a unique service offer, that gives us a potential commercial advantage to sell on the open market, which we do. And it tends to be things like, it varies. I sell procurement services to other people. It could be grass cutting. It could be legal services. It could be payroll management. It could be occupational health and safety stuff. So there's a lot of things that the council does that the local community and organisations can take benefit from. And we've done really well. It's only about 20 million quid's worth of business. Nevertheless, it's a big impact on our budget and protects roles and also gives us an opportunity to work closer with the community that we serve.
Do you think your background in procurement made you better at that role, Darren?
Yeah, it's kind of the reverse if you think about it. You're selling, not buying, but obviously the commercial skills are the same. The relationship management type stuff is the same. It does actually make you appreciate the variety of customers. So, for example, being candid, a relationship with, say, a senior officer in the fire and rescue service is very different than a head teacher, because head teachers always get their own way and they want it their way or no way. So from a variation of customer point of view, there's lots of things to learn, and it's good fun. And it's a good thing to do because we're actually doing good things for organisations that also serve in our community.
Darren, you've got a very fascinating career in procurement. You've quite varied in what you do, and it'd be kind of good to explore that. We were having a prep call, as we always do for these podcasts. I have to say, one of the things that just came across so strongly was your passion. When you talk about procurement in local government, you are genuinely passionate about that. So I'd love to understand a little bit about your background and how you came into the world of local government, and what is it that drives that passion that you can see as soon as you talk about the topic?
I mean, my background obviously is automotive, and that's where I was born in the procurement world. I worked for General Motors in Liverpool and did a graduate commercial apprenticeship. The exact same scheme actually as our Secretary of State for Education, Gillian Keegan, who's a friend of mine. Okay. So we worked together when we were younger. We were on the same programme. At the time, I was a part qualified accountant. General Motors decentralised all of its procurement operations worldwide. So we set up a new procurement department, and I became a buyer in that department. I think it was because, one, I've got a lot to say. Two, I wasn't very good with numbers. So they thought finance might not be the best career. So I ended up by mistake, as a lot of people do, in procurement, and really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it because it's the variety is wonderful. But, you know, from a legal point of view, technical point of view, commercial point of view, and just the interest is really high. I then got offered a job at the NatWest Bank in London and also Nissan, the new Nissan plant in Sunderland. I had a couple of weekends with my now wife, girlfriend at the time, in both London and the Northeast. And I said, if all things were equal, where would you want to live? And she said, definitely the Northeast, not London. One of the drivers at the time was the property prices were so high. So even though NatWest, I think they were giving me something like £80,000 cash towards a house, and I was only about 23. And I thought, oh, that's good. But when I looked around, I think I could have got a 1-bedroom flat at the time. And so anyway, so I went to the Northeast, worked at Nissan in Sunderland for 15 years and really enjoyed that. Working initially just locally in terms of vehicle parts for Sunderland. Then we Europeanized because we had a sister plant in Barcelona. So I became responsible for like a category or a part of the vehicle, but for Sunderland and Barcelona plants. So I had staff in both locations, and, you know, that was really interesting. And then Nissan went through a period of nigh on bankruptcy, formed an alliance with Renault, and I was one of 3 purchasing managers at the time who went to Paris to set up the Nissan Europe purchasing office. And so I worked there for a couple of years, really enjoyed that. But to be honest with you, as responsibility became more global, working between Nissan and Renault, your spend went up, but your technical scope reduced, so it became a lot narrower and, being candid, less interesting. But I'm not kidding, a big driver really was the amount of travel. And, you know, my kids were starting to grow up and my wife was getting a little bit frustrated. They're going from Sunderland to Paris, then Paris back to Sunderland, then potentially to Milton Keynes, and then potentially somewhere even further away back in another continent. So I decided to change career. And I thought, I want to do something different. I still wanted to do procurement, but in doing a different area of work. And, you know, I spoke to some headhunters and they said, look, you've got a great CV if you want to stay in automotive. But being candid, you're a one-trick pony, cars. So we think you need to do something to diversify. So I decided to do an MBA, a master's degree at Durham University Business School. And at the same time, I managed at the time, coincidentally, to bump into the chief exec of the local council. And he said, we're looking for procurement people, but we can't afford you. And at the time, they very kindly, you know, gave me a job, sponsored me MBA. I agreed to stay for a couple of years, and 15 years later, I'm still here. Thoroughly enjoy it. It's very varied in terms of the things that we procure, from schools and bridges and vehicles and waste and health and social care, and, you know, even stuff for the coroner, like non-invasive postmortems. If you like procurement, every day is a school day in local government. Trust me, there is no better job on the planet if you like procurement. And, you know, sad as it is, I do. So very varied. Doing good things in the community also is really rewarding. This may be controversial, but it's far more intellectually and technically challenging in local government than it ever was in the global private sector, to be honest. So I find it far more stimulating and interesting. And we'll probably come on to it later, but obviously social value is a big passion of mine, and being able to use your spend strategically to improve the social, economic and environmental well-being of your local place where you live is thoroughly rewarding, and doing good is good business. So I'm one of those crazy people on a Monday morning who comes in thinking, right, we've got a full week, we took the work together to do something, when everyone else is thinking, is it Friday? So I really enjoy it.
That's amazing. And actually, you touched on social value. You've had lots of roles in local government, but you undeniably a kind of leader in social value. A number of people I've heard you called Mr. Social Value. So for our listeners, which again would quite global, it'd be great if you could kind of, one, for people in other countries who may not even have heard the term, kind of what it means. But it does seem to me that the UK local government especially, is doing some incredibly interesting stuff. So I'd love to just get your perspective on the topic, really.
Yeah, initially the big driver stemmed out of necessity. A lot of people say, why are you so passionate about this? And doing good is good business. And I enjoy doing it. But if you can imagine when 35-40% of your spend is taken away by political choices made by central government, that means you have a lot less money to spend in your locality. And, without getting into politics, the north of England has been disproportionately affected compared to other regions. So every pound we spend, my mantra to my procurement team is always, we maximise the value of every single pound. And if we can get additionality, maximise the value of the pound to do good things in the community, that's actually helping us achieve the council's objectives, because fundamentally a council's job is to improve the social, economic and environmental welfare and well-being of its community. So if I can stretch those pounds, all the better. So for example, people say, well, what does it mean in real life? So it could be, for example, in my sales job, this is the reverse, obviously, from procurement. In my sales job, as one of the contracts that we won with a college, we committed, as well as delivering ICT services to the school, to teach the kids and the teachers cybersecurity as part of the curriculum. So that's us giving. The reverse is the case where, for example, we can't, unlike in the global private sector, we can't positively discriminate and say, right, I'm going to give this contract to this company because they're in County Durham. But what we can do is when we award a contract, we can, through using social value measurement techniques, through the competitive process, we can get commitments for local jobs, local spending, local apprenticeships, getting people who are unemployed back into work, prisoners who get released from prison back into work. So creating opportunities like that. Really good example, our primary school meals contract. We have fun to cook sessions. So the primary school meal provider goes into the school, teaches the young person how to cook, but they have to bring a parent or carer with them. Now, without getting too in depth in this, some young parents can't cook from fresh because they've never had to. So if you can get the parents in or the carers in with the kids and have a fun to cook session, you're teaching the children to cook, but you're also educating the parents to cook, which again is a good thing. We've had even little daft things like smoothie bikes, where the company brings in a bike, they bring in a load of fruit, apples and oranges, bananas, they put it in the front on the bike. The children pedal like mad on the bike, crushes the fruit, makes a smoothie drink. Kids like the taste, so we might have smoothies instead of fizzy Cokes. And so there's loads and loads of things that we do. We've had like Lloyd's Bank, for example. I've gone into school teaching young children about money matters, primary school children. So anything that we can do to stretch the value of the pound is a good thing. And what's really helpful is the new, we'll probably come on to the procurement bill later, but the new procurement regime has something embedded in it called the National Procurement Policy Statement. That means public procurers, all public procurers, not just local government, have to have regard for certain strategic priorities of the government. And some of those things are about creating jobs, creating new businesses, supply diversity, climate change, and so on. So that gives us more leverage with service managers and engineers to build social value opportunities into projects. And also we use social value criteria as part of our award process. So as well as the price and quality matters that you would consider, we also objectively include social value commitments. So that's good. And I think also a lot of organizations, I find these days, even global private sector organizations, they want to be seen to do good things. And I think also young people, far more than I ever did when I was really young, I've got far more moral and ethical views about what they buy and where they buy it from and who they buy it from and the type of company that they deal with. So social value is really, really important. It's a good thing to do, but being candid, in the northeast of England, it is an absolute necessity. It's not a choice. One of the most important things to think about, and a lot of councils get this, but not all do, and our chief executive does, and I'm really lucky in that regard. We're a £1.3 billion organisation. Yeah. We spend 700 million. So you're talking 50% of what we are is what we buy.
Yeah.
If we can use that spend strategically to deliver social value outcomes, we're helping the council achieve its objectives. All of a sudden, procurement became important, strategic, and a core capability of the council to be resourced effectively. We're not just buying things, if you see what I mean, which maybe they view in other organisations. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
no, it's really helpful. An observation from my perspective would be possibly because of that necessity, but it feels to me very much like local government, certainly in the context of the UK, is absolutely at the forefront of that agenda, well ahead of even other parts of government. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, definitely. We were very fortunate with the Public Services Social Value Act that came in 2013, raised the prominence of social value. I think because of austerity, councils had to do social value. So that was a key driver. But I think also, if you think about councils are very local in a place and have to serve a community. So in some regards, it's actually easier to deliver social value in local government than it might be, for example, if you were working in the Ministry of Defence.
Yeah. Where
you can still deliver social value, and they do a lot of good stuff, and I've got friends in that organisation that do good social value things, but it's harder. And maybe also, for example, if you worked in, say, a national public buying organisation, say like Crown Commercial Services, you're putting large framework agreements in place, not local contracts. So whilst you can build social value into the framework agreement, Crown Commercial Services themselves are not calling off necessarily from them framework agreements. It's other organisations that do. So when you do the call off and place the contract, then you can get the social value outcomes. But I think central government, by their own admission, will slow out the blocks. But in the last couple of years, since the PPN came in, which made social value mandatory in all procurements over a certain value with 10% weighting, central government now are very much developing well. I've got a good friend, Samantha Butler, who's in the Cabinet Office that led that work, and Samantha has spent time in local government. She was also is part of the National Social Value Task Force that I chaired for 7 years. So, those relationships have been helpful, and I think you'll find more and more central government will be pushing hard on social value, as will the wider public sector, because of the act that comes in on next October.
Yeah, perhaps we could quickly touch on that, Dan, because you mentioned about the upcoming procurement reform bill. It's one of the topics we've covered in a previous podcast, but again, would just love your perspective on that. I've heard you talk about it a number of times.
I really think it's a game changer for many, many reasons. One is simplicity. So at the minute, if you look at the public contract regulations, there's anything up to 7 different procedures, and there's different legislative landscapes depending on where you are on the public sector. So we'll have one set of rules. We'll have 3 procedures to follow. One, the typical open procedure, where anybody bids gets evaluated. There'll be a light touch regime for things like social care, which will be one of the variabilities. You'll have your usual urgency and crisis, where you just, because something, pandemic happens, an explosion happens, or you have to just do something straight away without any competitive processes. But the real game changer is something called the competitive flexible procedure. This is a gross oversimplification, but basically, so long as you are objective, transparent, fair, say what you're going to do and do what you said you're going to do, you can do what you want.
Yeah.
So you can design your own processes with your own time scales. You would even be able to negotiate on price as part of that process. So for me, I think you'll get, under the competitive flexible procedure, you'll get the benefit of public sector fairness, equality, transparency, with the innovativeness that you could get in, say, a private sector procurement process.
Yeah.
And it really will enable procurers, in my opinion, to deliver better outcomes. So that's the upside. But as with everything, there's a downside. So the transparency of it all is a very good thing, but it will be quite onerous. So throughout the procurement life cycle, when you'll have to do a pipeline that says what you're thinking about buying for the next 18 months, then tell the market what it is you might be doing, then tell the market you've started the process, then tell the market you've finished the process, then you've got to be reporting your key performance indicators, then you've got to publish notices that says we've changed the contract, then you've got to publish a notice that say the contract is finished or finishing. So every part of the procurement life cycle is transparent and reported, and it's all very visible. So there'll be an administrative burden there, but things will be far more open, things will be far more transparent. And I think there'll be a lot of training and education required when it comes in. But, I've always said with Cabinet Office Office on this, and my hands are dirty because I've helped be part of the creation of it. It's overall, I would give them 9 out of 10. So to have a local government person stand up and say, Cabinet Office 9 out of 10, that doesn't happen very often,
Praise indeed.
So fair play. Sam Robury in Cabinet Office and Lindsay Maguire have done a fantastic job in the early engagement, talking to people about what they would like in, working with people through the consultation process. And even now, when the bill's gone through the House of Lords and Commons, and they're into what they call ping pong, which is like final minor changes and secondary legislation stuff, they're still consulting about, what do you think about this? What's your view about that? To practitioners. So not only the outcome is good, but the method by which we're achieving the outcome is really, really positive. So, I've got rose-tinted contact lenses in today, but for me, the good far outweighs the bad, and I think it'll be wonderful.
That's brilliant. And Darren, the other thing I read on LinkedIn earlier in the year is you're retiring, I think, at the end of this year at the tender age of 58, which I also couldn't believe. I can't believe you're 58. You obviously look, 10 years younger. I was interested, what prompted that? Obviously, as we said, you're very passionate about what you do.
I'm really, really lucky. I mean, I've led local government procurement through the National Advisory Group for 3 years. I've led the National Social Value Task Force for 7 years. That's on top of my day job. And our chief executive has always been really, really supportive of allowing me time and freedom to do that, because it's, interesting for me. It's doing good things, a good reputation for Durham. But I made a mistake, or maybe not a mistake. I'd always wanted to buy a motorhome, and I bought one. And then I realised I really liked travelling in it. And I just thought, if I could spend a little bit more time in the motorhome and have longer weekends, that would be a good thing. So I decided that the end of this year, 31st of December this year, I'm going to leave local government to spend a little bit more time with my wife and my daughter's Chihuahua dog in the motorhome and do a bit of travelling. But, I am a young 58, I'd like to think. So I still intend to do some things. I'm currently in conversation with a couple of organisations about doing something on a part-time basis, but it will still be procurement stuff. I love it. And I do also think to go from doing everything to doing nothing would be a bit of a shock to the system. So spending a couple of years, maybe 2-3 days a week, doing stuff that I want to do, I'd like to do, that's interesting, that I can still learn from, but also give something back, would be really good. And it gives me a bit of chance to spend a bit more time with the wife and the Chihuahua and go to places like Scotland and Devon and things, because the motorhome life's good. And bizarrely, actually, I mean, I've got Wi-Fi in the van. I could actually work from the van if I really wanted to. To be honest, I think I've surprised a few people when I said I was semi-retiring. My boss initially just said, have you fell out with somebody? I said, well, no more than usual. Has somebody upset you? No, I just want to do other things. And being candid, I'm really lucky to be able to do that. So we'll see what holds out. And I've stepped down from my national roles, but I've still got my day job, which I love. But 31st of December, I might have a week or two off and then do something completely different.
My last question, Darren, you've had this long career in procurement. You've done lots of different things. You must have learned enormous amounts of lessons in that time. Any final procurement lesson you would leave our listeners with as an important?
Yeah, I think on a serious note, understand your customer or end user as much as you can in order to meet their needs, and make sure that you procure things that they actually need rather than necessarily want. And this might get cut from the podcast, but as a very young buyer in General Motors, working in a factory of 2,500 women, I resourced sanitary wear for females, right. The things that came in machines on the wall, and saved a fortune. And I was put in the company magazine as this bright young buyer who's in this new department. He saved all this money, and then walking down the factory floor one day, a very rotund lady grabbed me and said, "Are you that young man who's made the savings on the sanitary wear?" And I very proudly said, yes, that's me. And she says, well, I used to use 1, I now have to use 3. Now, I didn't realise, because of my lack of customer engagement, that these things come in different shapes and sizes. And basically, I'd spec down, saved a fortune, but spec down, and then had to suffer the embarrassment to go and tell the then Chief Procurement Officer I was putting all the prices back up and the savings I'd made were meaningless. Nevertheless, despite that funny story, a really, really early important lesson. And I've always told it when I was at Nissan, and we used to get new graduate procurement people in every year. Part of the formal training, I always told that funny story to, 1, to give them a giggle, but 2, to make them realise the importance of understand your customer, talk to your customer, understand what they need, make sure the outcome, the specification, whatever, is fit for purpose, because otherwise it'll come back to bite you.
Darren, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really interesting conversation. We covered a lot, but it's super interesting. So yeah, thanks for taking the time.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give us a click on the follow button on your chosen podcast platform. We'd also love to hear your views on either future topics, or indeed if you've got any thoughts on future guests that we should look to get onto the podcast. Thanks again. See you next time.